Welcome to this Costs of War Project webinar. I'm Stephanie Savell. I'm the director of the Costs of War Project. And for well over a decade, the Costs of War Project has shed light on the costs of the so-called U.S. war on terror. Now we're examining the devastating costs of U.S. military spending and operations in the post-October 7th wars, which in the case of Gaza, many experts call a genocide. On October 7, 2025, 2 years after the October 7, 2023 Hamas attack on Israel, we published a series of 4 research papers, which you can find on our website, www.costsofwar.org, on the budgetary cost to U.S. taxpayers of U.S. military aid to Israel and U.S. military operations in the region since then. This U.S. spending in the post-9/11 wars has come with an extensive human toll. Over 10% of the population of Gaza has been killed or injured, while at least 5.27 million people have been displaced in Gaza and the wider region. This research will inform efforts to stop the mass killing and displacement, move beyond the war paradigm, and explore true solutions toward peace. Today, you'll hear from the 4 authors in a conversation moderated by Trita Parsi, Executive Vice President and co-founder of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, a transpartisan, action-oriented think tank established to challenge the decades-long obsession of U.S. foreign policy decision-makers with global military dominance and war. I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Parsi, an award-winning author and the 2010 recipient of the Grawemeyer Award for Ideas Improving World Order. He's an expert on U.S.-Iranian relations, Iranian foreign policy, and the geopolitics of the Middle East. He has authored 4 books on U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East, with a particular focus on Iran and Israel. Now, I'll say to our audience at this point, please put your questions throughout the event in the Q&A feature, not the chat function, which isn't working on this webinar. Again, please put your questions in the Q&A throughout the event, and we'll take them throughout the event. And at this point, I'll turn the conversation over to Trita. Thank you so much for being here and for moderating the event.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. It's a great pleasure to be here with all of you. It's a particular honor to do this together with the Cost of War Project, mindful of the amazing work the Cost of War Project has done over the years in really documenting the costs in various ways of the many, many different wars, most of them unnecessary, that have been fought. And in this specific webinar, we will deal with several aspects of the slaughter that has been taking place in Gaza. Everything from how much the United States has spent on it to what the United States has spent on warfare around the conflict itself in terms of conflicts that have come out as a result of the warfare in Gaza, to the human displacement, as well as, of course, the human toll itself. And we have the 4 amazing authors of these 4 papers here with us. Without any further ado, let me introduce them one by one. First, we have Linda Bilmes, who is a senior lecturer in public policy and public finance at the Harvard Kennedy School. Her research focuses on how budgetary resources are allocated, particularly with respect to veterans and the military. She's the author of the New York Times bestseller, The $3 Trillion War, among other books and publications. Second, we have Neta Crawford, who is a co-founder and strategic advisor of the Cost of War Project and chair in international relations at the University of Oxford. Her work is on war, ethics, and climate change. She's the author of The Pentagon, Climate Change and War, Charting the Rise and Fall of U.S. Military Emissions. Among other books and publications, she is also, I'm very proud to say, a non-resident fellow at my organization, the Quincy Institute. Then we have Bill Hartung, which you might be able to see is sitting right behind me over there. This is not how we planned it, but this is how it ended up being, who is a senior research fellow at the Quincy Institute, whose work focuses on the arms industry and the U.S. military budget. His work is regularly featured in the media and is the co-author of a new book. Very excited about this new book coming out, The $1 Trillion War Machine, How Runaway Military Spending Drives America into Foreign Wars and Bankrupts Us at Home, among other books. And finally, David Vine is a political anthropologist and the author of the trilogy of books about war and peace, including The United States of War, A Global History of America's Endless Conflicts from Columbus to the Islamic State. Dr. Vine was a professor of anthropology at the American University here in Washington for 18 years. So welcome to you all. What I would like to do is go through, give you all a chance to briefly tell us the key findings. I'm going to start with you, Neta. Your paper documents and concludes that the Israeli Defense Forces have killed and seriously injured more than 10% of the entire population of Gaza. Please give us a summary of your key findings.
Well, it's been an escalating conflict. The most intense fighting, bombardment occurred very early on, and that's when most of the people were killed, a large number of the people. 68,000 people have been killed to date, more than, and 170,000 have been injured. And that's roughly a rate of 2,854 people a month. This, of course, waxes and wanes, and we're in a period when the killing is slightly lower, though it had escalated earlier. 470 or so IDF, that is Israeli Defense Forces, have been killed since the offensive began. But the larger picture is not only the deaths and the injuries, which are the direct results of bombs, bullets, and fire. They include, of course, the ongoing famine, which was declared earlier this year, which has at risk nearly everyone in Gaza. The destruction of most of the infrastructure, including water and sanitation. Only 14 out of the 36 hospitals are now functioning. 1,700 healthcare workers have been killed, at least. Without water, without food, without sanitation, people living in refugee camps, new diseases that were less prevalent have now sprung up, including meningitis, which is growing, especially for children. 92% of the schools will require some form of reconstruction, if not entirely rebuilding. And in the larger region, we see that the Israeli bombardment of Lebanon is an effort to destroy Hezbollah, or at least damage Hezbollah, killed an additional at least 4,000 people. Then, in addition, there are other things that the Israelis have been doing. The Israeli military has attacked Yemen, Syria, and, as we know, Qatar briefly. So the Israeli Defense Forces have been quite active in not only destruction, but actually blocking aid from coming in, which will exacerbate the conflict. And I can get into the consequences of that later.
Very good. Thank you so much, Neta. Yeah, I have several questions about this. But let's first move on to the other papers and speakers. Linda, your paper looks at the cost of the U.S. military itself has incurred as a result of supporting Israel's slaughter in Gaza, the wars in Yemen, the attack on Iran. Please share us your findings.
Yes. Hi. Thank you so much, Trita. So I'm Linda Bilmes, and I've been studying war costs in various parts of the world for the past 25 years. One of the issues in terms of talking about cost of wars is that there is, in national security circles, this idea of the secrecy dilemma, the idea that we really, in a democracy, need to understand what things cost more than in any other area. However, in national security circles, there's the idea that, in fact, this is the one area where the public shouldn't really know what things cost because it could put us in danger. So I am more on the side of transparency. And since the U.S. government doesn't really tell us the cost of wars and most military operations, and the purpose of my participation here is in the interest of transparency to sort of put a number around what has been spent. Now, the portion of this that I estimated was the cost to the United States of what we have spent out in the wider Middle East, apart from specifically aid to Israel. So these are interests that are precipitated by the post-October 7th environment, but sort of overlap, Venn diagram sense with interests that pertain to the United States and maybe to other allies such as Gulf states. The U.S. has, over the past year, vastly expanded its activities in the region, particularly in the Red Sea area and around the Gulf of Aden, with its indirect and direct operations against the Houthis. It has also, as is widely known, participated in the so-called 12-day war in its Operation Midnight Hammer, attacking Iranian nuclear facilities. And the cost of those two military efforts, the effort against the Houthis and the effort against the Iranians, is alone a sort of $9 to $12 billion effort over the last 2 years. And I always say when I'm speaking to people, I always try and call out the distinction between a million and a billion and a trillion, because they rhyme in English and they sound the same. But if you had a million seconds, that's like 11 days ago. That's like last week. If you have a billion seconds, that's 31 years ago. That's 1994 when The Lion King came out. And a trillion, when we talk about the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, we're talking trillions. That's 31,000 years ago. That's when the woolly mammoths roamed the world. So we are talking already here, after a pretty short amount of time, well into the billions. Now, why are these activities so expensive? I can talk more about it later. But in the Houthi operation, the largest expense is the fact that we have deployed one carrier strike group for pretty much the entire year to the theater. And a carrier strike group is a huge operation involving not only the cruise ship, but several supply ships, 75 aircraft, a lot of other ships, 7,500 sailors and Marines. It is like a city on involving many aircraft, ships, submarines, and other equipment. So just the cost of keeping that thing afloat is around $9 million a day. And we only have 11 of them in the world, one of which is always stationed off Japan, and they can only be out to sea for a few months at a time. So we've had to rotate considerably. Additionally, this year during what was called Operation Rough Rider, we deployed a second carrier strike group specifically to this operation, to another enormous amount of cost. On the Iranian side, the big cost drivers included both the use of B-2 stealth bombers, which are the most expensive bombers we have ever produced, over $2 billion per plane, and which were dropping the 30,000-pound bunker buster bombs on the Iranian nuclear facilities. And a lot can be said on this, but it's important to note that these bombs have never been used before, and that these planes, of which only a very, very small number of them were ever built at a cost total of over $43 billion, have hardly been used. But they are the only planes that were capable of carrying this kind of payload. And secondly, a kind of defensive operation in protecting Israel using THAAD, which are the high altitude missiles, which was a very expensive operation that the U.S. paid for to defend Israel from incoming real and potential Iranian missiles. So those are sort of the main cost drivers of this cost. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you so much. And Linda, I got more questions for you coming as well. But let's move on to Bill. The U.S. has actively aided Israel's military, as Linda just explained, during this period by providing aid. In your paper, you do the account of how much America's taxpayers' money was sent to Israel during this period for Israel's own weaponry and ammunition. So tell us what your paper concluded.
Well, I think the most interesting thing is, as the killing went on, be it Biden, be it Trump, there was this notion that we don't have that much leverage. But if you look at the Israeli armed forces, every single combat aircraft that they possess is from the United States. And those are complex things. They need spare parts, they need maintenance. And so when the Biden administration says we have to investigate whether our weapons are being used to abuse human rights, it was laughable. And then, of course, thousands and thousands of bombs that were used in Gaza, targeting systems that accelerated how many targets they could hit in a certain amount of time. And the $21 billion is a combination of money for Israel to buy weapons, and more importantly, to the conflict, things in war reserves that existed could be quickly shipped to Israel, including one that was actually in Israel, but allegedly was supposed to be only released with congressional approval. But of course, that went out the window in this conflict. So the main thing we did is we just gathered these diverse sources of aid. And then there's new sales of tens of billions, which will happen over the next few years. Once the things are built, more money will be put forward to pay for them. So this is just the beginning of the cost of this war. And the least transparent part is, when is it delivered? There's sometimes they, under Biden, they made 100 deals that were under the threshold for reporting them to Congress. So there's big flows of weapons that Congress didn't even know about, which leads me to believe probably our estimate is conservative. But the one thing I noticed when we released the first round of papers, there was a very detailed paper about how many more casualties there were in Gaza than the common numbers. And then there was the dollar amount. And the dollar amount got a lot of play, and it was like pulling teeth to get the press to write about the people. Money reigned. And I think that's still to some degree true, and it is shameful.
Thank you. David, one of the issues that has received the least amount of attention, though, is the population displacement that has taken place, not just in Gaza itself, which has received some attention, but the fact that it also caused a lot of displacement taking place outside of Israel and Gaza itself because of how this war actually spread throughout the region. Tell us what your paper concluded on this matter.
Thank you, Trita. Indeed, mass displacement has been a major feature of all the violence and genocide since October 7th, 2023. I do want to just say a quick thanks to the other authors and to everyone who's joined us today, as well as in particular to Stephanie Savell and Ellen White and Mimi Healy, who run the Cost of War Project and really do an incredible service to all of us in the world. So as Bill really spoke eloquently, I think the people involved often don't get the attention they deserve. And it was one of the challenges I had in writing this report, trying to document all the people who've been displaced in Gaza, the West Bank, Israel, Lebanon, Iran, Syria, Yemen, Qatar, at very least. The people, how does one wrap one's brain around 5.27 million people displaced across the region since October 7th, 2023? That's the top line, and that's a conservative estimate. Poetry has actually been helpful to me, a poem that I come back to, The Pedagogy of Conflict, that just briefly I'll read a small portion of to try to connect with what it means to be displaced or to lose one's family members, as Neta has helped us understand. The poet Pedro Tuma says, "When I was a child, I learned to count to 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But these days, I've been counting lives. So I count 1 life, 1 life, 1 life, 1 life, 1 life. Because each time is the first time that life has been taken." So I tried in my report to call attention to the individuals behind the numbers, and I just can provide more numbers, but I would encourage people to try to grapple with a single life and what it means to be displaced or to have a life taken. But yes, in Gaza in particular, as many know, more than 2 million people have been displaced. Almost everyone in Gaza, more than 92%. Another 43,000 plus have been displaced in the West Bank. Over 212,000 people displaced in Israel. More than 2 million displaced in Iran in just 12 days of war. And that could be a very conservative estimate. almost 1 million in Lebanon. And I'd be happy to get into the details more, but just start there.
Well, let's start with your paper in that case, David. You show, 5.27 million displaced is just extremely difficult to wrap your head around that number, as you have pointed out. Could you help put that in context, though, in the sense of, did we see this level of displacement outside of the actual war area in terms of Iraq and the wars in Afghanistan or Israel-Lebanon in 2006, meaning that this conflict has had and it has spread in a way that it appears that at least immediately after the invasion of Iraq, we did not see the spillover effect. We saw it 10 years later or 8 years later. But here, the spillover effect seems to have come very, very quickly. Can you tell us, with all of your knowledge about displacement, is there anything that compares to this?
We saw indeed mass displacement in the post 9/11 wars, and this report that I published with the others on the 7th of this year follows on and follows the methodology of a prior report that I wrote with a group of students from American University in 2020, documenting displacement in Afghanistan, Iraq, and the other countries affected by the U.S.-led war on terror. The closest comparison is across 20 years of war in Afghanistan alone, we saw 5.9 million people displaced, 5.9 million people displaced in 20 years of war. And here in about 2 years of war, we have seen nearly that level of displacement across the region.
So
I think it is
not just a shorter time period, but a much larger geographical area as well.
Indeed. And I do think there's one other really important thing to stress at the outset, which is that in Afghanistan and Iraq and other war zones, including in Lebanon and Iran and elsewhere, we see people fleeing war, as we see people fleeing war in Congo and Sudan and elsewhere. What is different about Gaza in particular is that we're not just seeing people fleeing war, we're seeing mass expulsion as a tool that appears to have been explicitly pursued by the Israeli government with U.S. government support. Many experts have identified this, characterized this as a war crime and as a potential crime against humanity. And beyond that, as my report suggests, mass expulsion has been a tool of genocide, along with starvation and direct killing.
Very interesting and sad, of course. Bill, I want to shift a little bit to your paper. Your paper points out that $21.7 billion have already been provided in military aid from the United States to Israel. But the breakdown of it is rather interesting because the first year saw 17.9 billion and the second year 3.8. So we see a significant reduction there. I wanted to see if you see any explanation as to why it dropped and what your expectation is of what the numbers will be in 2025, and if that is going to be a continuation of a trend or if there may be some difference between the Biden and the Trump administrations on this.
Well, when the money is sent, it's not always all spent in the same year. So part of it is that some of the money from the first year was still there to buy weapons. I think the other thing is it was front loaded and there was so much destruction done in year one that the idea of sending them tens of thousands of bombs in year two was redundant. I mean, year two, the issue was keeping them from escalating in the region, which they did anyway. So I think part of it was just, that 17.9 billion leaked over into the second year. And this is one of the...
But that essentially means we sent them more weapons than they actually could use. Despite all of the destruction they did, we actually sent them more than they even could use.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Yes. Well, there were some estimates that actually over the 2 years, we had to replace their entire inventory of bombs. That they used them intensively in the first year. So there was another example of how indispensable U.S. aid was to Israel being able to do the destruction they did, which is why that was our strongest leverage, which really was not used as the death.
So this is also very interesting because I remember in the 2006 war between Israel and Lebanon, the Israelis were complaining that the arms shipments from the United States were not coming fast enough. And that as a result, there were limitations to what they could do because they didn't get the ammunition, the bombs, etc., fast enough. Here we have the opposite problem, apparently, in the sense that we're just overflowing them with weapons, which then enables them to do massive amount of damage while we're at the same time saying that we don't have any leverage. But there actually seems to have been a shift in the manner that we do this compared to what the Bush administration with Dick Cheney in office did back in 2006.
Yeah, I think a lot of it, because it came from stocks, it could be sent almost immediately. And of course, Hamas did not have anti-aircraft. The average person in Gaza was absolutely defenseless against this. So this was not like a test of technology. This was slaughter against primarily defenseless people.
Mm-hmm. Linda, I want to jump to your paper quickly. You mentioned in your paper that the U.S. spent up to $4.95 billion on fighting the Houthis and a total of 7.2 in 2025 if you also include the money that was spent on U.S. war with Iran. The entire military budget of the Houthis is $1.71 billion. I just want to be clear. Are you saying that the United States spent in 2025 almost 3 times the entire budget of the Houthis in order to fight the Houthis to a standstill?
Yeah, well, thank you for asking about this. I mean, I think the Houthi operation is particularly noticeable and will go down in history as one of the most asymmetric military operations ever. The United States is basically spending $1 to $2 million per missile to hit down a $200 Houthi drone. Now, the Houthis have been at war in the Gulf, particularly with the Saudis, for 15 years. The Houthis themselves are a rebel group that I think the United States doesn't really understand totally. And they're in Yemen, which is a huge country. It's twice the size of Wyoming. So they have buried these little drones all over the place. In the first year of the post-October 7th, Houthis were getting ready-made drones from the Iranians, which were costing $200, $300. Now they're actually assembling components so they can make little drones for $50, $100. And we are still spending $1 million, $2 million to hit back at every single one of these Houthi drones. The expenditure of resources around this is highly asymmetrical. It's also highly questionable whether we have really achieved anything or any of our goals here. The Houthis have been recently incapacitated by an Israeli hit, but after 2 years of the United States trying to hit down Houthi drones to protect international shipping, the vast majority of shipping has already adjusted to the situation in the Red Sea and are re-navigating around the Cape of Good Hope. So the insurance companies, the shipping companies, most of which are international, have already kind of adjusted themselves to the reality. So the whole operation you have to question whether we are dealing with the Houthis in the right way and whether this is a wise expenditure of money. I mean, I also just wanted to raise the issue and make sure that we drop it into this conversation that when we're talking about money, and we're talking about here from $35 billion over this last 2 years on these operations, people always ask me, like, well, where does it come from? Where does the money come from? And there is this sort of like very small question about which line item in the budget does it come from, this foreign military aid bill or this one. But I think the big point is that this is all money that the United States has borrowed. You know, we are a country with a $37 trillion debt and a 1.7 trillion, we're talking woolly mammoths, $1 trillion just annual deficit. So all of this is money that we haven't paid for yet, but that we have sort of transferred to the next generation. It's an intergenerational transfer. And no one has decided specifically whether we should pay more for this expenditure as opposed to paying more for veterans benefits or for school lunches or any other issue. So we need to consider this all in the context of the fact that we're putting it all on the national credit card.
That's really a very, very important point. Neta, I wanted to bring you into the conversation on your excellent paper. You conclude that roughly 80% of the people killed in Gaza were civilians. You compare it to the numbers in Afghanistan, which was 26, and the numbers in Ukraine, which is 4. The rate of killings are also dramatically higher, 2,806 a month in Gaza, 772 in Afghanistan. In all of the many, many wars that you have studied over the years, do we have any example in recent or non-recent memory in which the civilian percentage have been anywhere near this level in any war?
Yes, and those are genocides. So think about the incredible rate of killing in the very short time in Rwanda in 1994. That's the most recent example. There's a high rate of killing in some civil wars that approaches this. Yes. So this is not unprecedented. There are other examples of high rates of killing. But in comparison to other very sort of post 2000 wars, this is a high rate.
And in the case of Rwanda, I mean, we're as you said, we're talking about a genocide in which the armies are essentially fighting civilians. They are defenseless, and this is the reason why you have those.
Right. It was people who were defenseless, of course, and it was a civil conflict. It was one group against another. Rwanda stands out in so many ways. The intensity of the killing, over a few weeks, the sort of absence of any eyes on or attempt to stop it by the United Nations. And I think that, I raise it as a recent example, but no, there isn't really anything in the last couple of decades that approaches this pace. There's been civil wars in Africa that have been extremely violent as well. The occupation of East Timor by Indonesia. I mean, we see examples of this, but generally, when you see this rate of killing this high, it is against defenseless people.
You also conclude that more humanitarian workers have been killed in Gaza over 2 years than through the course of the entire 20 years of the U.S.-led war in Afghanistan. 554 in Gaza, 446 in Afghanistan, and 32 in Ukraine. What are the factors that are contributed to this terrible rate of killing of humanitarian workers?
Well, essentially, they're close to the action. So the people who are killed at aid centers, if the Israelis are targeting people near the aid centers, they're going to be hurt. Most, in fact, of the people who are killed are not international aid workers. They're the national aid workers. And some people feel that they are being targeted. So locations and names of the aid workers are often kept secret. This is, I think, partly also a lack of eyes on. There are no international reporters in Gaza and haven't been since the start of the war. And if there were more people observing, then we might see more care being taken. The other thing that you have to realize is these aid workers are incredibly courageous. They're going to people in need, in dangerous situations. They're in the refugee camps. They willingly put themselves out there to help. And given that the weapons are large, 500, 1,000, 2,000-pound bombs with a 2 football field wide area of destruction, even if the workers are not in the immediate target zone, they will be killed along with the people that they're trying to help.
But the fact that the levels are so much higher than these other wars that you compare it to, does that in and of itself say that statistically it is extremely unlikely that the aid workers are not deliberately targeted? Or does the number in and of itself not give you a suggestion in either direction?
Well, I think intention is at the core of much of this. And the way that we think about intention is this target intentionally targeted? Was there a lack of discrimination between civilians and military? So I think that given that Israel understands anyone who works with, that is alongside Hamas, or who is a member of Hamas, is a legitimate target, then there is a lack of discrimination for the aid workers. I can't say that it's intentional. I can say that constant care has not been, I think, the byword of the behavior there.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. We have a question from the audience, from Matthew Kanjirathinkala, and I probably butchered the name there. Ask a very important question, and I think it could be addressed by all of you. Can you address the question of who in the United States is benefiting from this war? We hear the term military-industrial complex, but can you break it down? Besides the weapons manufacturers, who else is benefiting from this slaughter? University foundations, think tanks, NGOs, etc. And I open that to all of you, and perhaps we can start off with you, David.
Well, I think in many ways, Bill's work has, in greatest detail, shown us how weapons manufacturers and other war profiteers have benefited, enriched themselves off the killing and genocide. I think look no further than the weapons manufacturers who have benefited to the tune of billions of dollars, certainly in the course of the entire U.S. military budget, but likely in the case of U.S. funding for Israel as well. But politicians clearly have also benefited. There are indeed academics at universities who have provided research. The tech companies like Amazon and Google, and again, others can speak to this better than I can, but numerous tech companies have helped support Israel's genocide and the U.S. support that has backed up Israel's genocide and wider war making in Iran, Lebanon, and beyond.
Bill, do you want to chime in? You're on mute.
I was telling secrets, but people think of the companies like Lockheed Martin and Boeing and RTX that make the planes and the bombs, but there's companies like Palantir whose software is being used to accelerate the killing, and unlike the other companies which are a bit circumspect, they're practically cheering. They did a board meeting in Israel during the Gaza war because they thought the other weapons manufacturers weren't being vocal enough in their support of Israel. And even things that might seem, commercial. There's been some research about how the spare parts get to Israel to keep those U.S. planes running. Some of them go via FedEx out of the San Francisco airport. And of course, during the course of the occupation, things like tractors, are used to demolish buildings and worse. So there's a whole range of many, many companies. And then, of course, as David said, the universities that are getting the money to do this research. And there's a new surge of Pentagon money to universities in keeping with the emerging technologies. The big companies don't have the technical and scientific expertise to do the development. So they're pouring more and more money into universities. And often people don't know. I mean, if you walked across the campus at Berkeley, you would not know that they manage a nuclear weapons facility. Or if you're at Johns Hopkins, 40 miles away, their physics lab gets $1 billion a year from the Pentagon, works on things like intercontinental ballistic missiles. So it's kind of embedded in the university system. And during the Vietnam period, there were protests, but part of what happened is they spun off labs nearby and there was still interaction. So I think the the ceasefire movement researchers are starting to look at the bigger picture of the military's relation to U.S. universities, not just with respect to Israel, but in terms of U.S. ability to intervene all over the world. So I think it's positive in the sense that people are looking a little further than the current conflict, which is horrific in its own right.
Very interesting. Neta and Linda, do you want to chime in as well? Yeah, Linda, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to put a couple of numbers on this. So if you just look at defense manufacturers over the last 25 years, there are two sort of features that I look at. And one is that their stock prices have gone up 60% above the S&P during this period. And secondly, that there has been an enormous wave of consolidation. So the larger defense companies have been able to purchase these smaller ones, consolidating, raising prices. But I think that Eisenhower called out the military-industrial complex a long time ago, but the structure of the entire U.S. military is very, very much based around a collaboration with the private sector. The overall defense budget is about 50% private sector companies who perform really every possible aspect of defense work, from basic research, as Bill was saying, to deployment, to cooking meals out in the field, to repairing equipment and so forth, and to through to and including Amazon being the main web server cloud carrier and so on. So you have and there is a lack of transparency around this, because those who are in the private sector are, of course, incentivized to maximize their profits, because that's what they're supposed to do, is the private sector, but also because they are protected from a lot of reporting requirements, because they can claim that they are at a competitive disadvantage if they report information. So it's very difficult for those of us who actually work on this to even understand fully the amount of profits that are derived by many, many defense companies from their contracts with the government. And then, even to the extent one can, the Defense Department overall has never been able to pass or even come close to passing an audit, and cannot account for about 40% of its costs, at least 40%, and its accounting is something I could run many webinars on. So I think all of these things mean that it is a massive problem, and not only related to this current conflict.
There's one other thing, which is $20 billion is a lot of money compared to, say, domestic needs here, but the Pentagon's getting $1 trillion a year. So these companies would be fine if they weren't doing this, but it's voracious. There's never enough. And certain kind of companies like Oshkosh Truck was losing Pentagon contracts, so they upped their sales to Israel during the war. So there's these niche companies that live off of exports, but the basic story is there's never enough. If these companies are allowed to manipulate our foreign policy, standards are going to go down. The amount we spend in them is going to go up. But you could have a perfectly reasonable defense sector without all this excess. But it's kind of the worst of both worlds. It's capitalist, but it's also government dependent. So it's kind of this hybrid, the worst of both worlds.
So if I could take that same question, but turn it around a little bit, and we can talk a little bit more also about the leverage the U.S. has with Israel as a result of all of this. But if we ask ourselves who benefited from this, who could have stopped this on the American end? I mean, were there things Congress could have done, should have done to be able to prevent this? Or does it not have the tools to be able to put an end to something like this in terms of what we have seen in Gaza?
Well, I think there's a political problem, of course. There were 3 resolutions to stop, perhaps 4, to stop arms sales to Israel, which had never been done before. They had never been challenged. And the final one in the Senate, the majority of Senate Democrats voted for it. So in political terms, that was a change, but it didn't change anything on the ground in Gaza. And in general, arms sales fly through without a word being said. And for Congress to stop one, they needed a veto-proof majority of both houses, which they have never done. So one proposal had been serious cells have to actually be affirmatively approved by the Congress, which gives Congress a lot more power. Whether they would use that power responsibly or usefully would depend on the public pressure, but at least they would have the tool. As it is now, it's almost impossible. It's really pretty much up to the president to bring a stop to these things, with the exception of the occasional cutoff of aid to a particular regime.
Neta, do you want to come in on this as well? You're on mute.
I'd really, there's so many things that are exciting and worrisome here. But one is, over 20 years of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, we saw the incredible concentration of power, the diminished capacity of the judiciary of the United States to even comment about extrajudicial killings, too few hearings. And we see the same pattern here, too little discourse. In other words, democracy suffers, small d democracy suffers when there's been long-term militarization like this. And we've had a chilling of the speech over anything to do with Israel and Palestine for decades. But the inability to have a civil conversation about these questions has hurt us. And that's what we need to do. We need to bolster small d democracy. But if possible, I'd like to raise some things that haven't come up yet, which I think are really important. One of which is we're looking at this in sort of a short-term way. Okay, the long-term effects of the war are everywhere. First of all, in terms of the indirect death, it's not just the famine, but the destruction of infrastructure, including not just water and sanitation, but everything else. Will mean that people will die for years afterwards of things that they wouldn't have had to die from in Gaza. And not to mention the stunting from the famine. Also, longer term, we need to think about the damage to the environment of the region, right, which people depend on. There very little, less than 2% of the agricultural capacity of Gaza remains for people to grow food. And there's poisoning of the groundwater and on environmentally, which has human health impacts. And then thinking about it even further afield, greenhouse gas emissions from this war are significant. And we don't tend to think about greenhouse gas emissions from any military activity, but the United States' own greenhouse gas emissions are related to the war, military emissions. But Israel's emissions are higher from their activities in the region, but they don't report them. So that's a global and long-term impact. And then finally, think about not just military spending, for the U.S. or this other money that's being spent in terms of aid, but entire world military spending has increased. I think 20% over the last year. There's a sort of militarized Middle East as a result of this conflict, but that also drives military spending into Europe. And overall military spending has increased. This is because of the way we buy weapons and staff militaries. This is in train for years to come. It won't end once these conflicts are over. So I think we need to think beyond the moment and look at the longer term impact in these various ways.
So on that point, Neta, thank you so much for bringing that up. Could we throw to David a reaction to what Neta said in terms of, can you project what the mass displacement of people will be when some of the consequences that Neta just put forward are starting to be seen? If it's been 5 million so far, what do you expect it will be and all of the different implications that will have once you will start seeing all of these other problems, including agricultural and environmental changes that will occur as a result of this?
It's very difficult to project, but I think we have to insist that the violence, killing, the genocide stops. We have a very tenuous ceasefire that has been only partial because Palestinians in Gaza have been killed over the last several days. We have seen people going home, or to the remnants of their homes, to the rubble of their homes, people returning to Gaza City and further north, which I think is also a reminder of the strength of Palestinians and others living under horrific conditions, the desire to go home. And I think we have to insist on reparations for the displaced, as well as the ability to go home and live in an environment that's suitable for going home. I do just want to go back to the question of what could have been done to stop this, what could to stop this, and to remind everyone in terms of the beneficiaries, we can't overlook, of course, Israeli weapons manufacturers and other military contractors, as well as Netanyahu among the biggest beneficiaries. But we also have to remember that many of us may be invested in some of these companies, especially if we are invested in a mutual fund or any index stock. I have to admit, with tremendous shame, that a couple of years ago, I realized I was invested in a weapons manufacturer and needed to divest. So there are things we can do personally. The members of Congress in the House and the Senate, of course, can do so much more, but the power of two of the most powerful lobbies in Washington, D.C., that is the weapons manufacturers and the pro-Israeli government lobby, is part of what has allowed this genocide and larger warfare to go on. But a growing number of members of the House are now signed on to a bill to block the shipment of weapons to Israel. And there needs to be a comparable bill in the Senate. There is, as far as I know, still not one. So there is so much room for members of Congress to stop this, including to stop the yearly gifts that the U.S. taxpayers, the U.S. government provides to the Israeli government. The $3.8 billion that gets talked about in terms of U.S. aid to Israel. This is not aid. These are gifts from U.S. taxpayers that do not have to be made.
Thank you, David. Neta, we don't have much time, so I'm going to ask you all to perhaps limit your questions to shorter answers, but there's a very critical element in your paper, which is talking about the non-combatant casualty cutoff value, the NCV. And I think it gives a big understanding of what has changed here in the sense of how many people can be afforded to be killed that are not combatants. And in Afghanistan, 224 bombs were dropped on average per day over 20 years. In Iraq, it was 942. In Gaza, it's 1,000 and more. So a key reason as to why so many more people are being killed, including more civilians, is it seems like rules have just completely changed. And whatever restrictions existed in the past in terms of norms around the use of force have just been set aside. Can you tell us something about how these restrictions, the NCV, the norms around this have evolved over the last 20 years, both in the American military and seemingly in the Israeli military, and what the role the U.S. has in terms of what are the NCVs that the Israelis adopt? Do we have a say in it? Are we greenlighting this?
It would take an hour, but very quickly.
You have 2 minutes, so do your best.
The United States non-combatant casualty cutoff value has tended to get smaller and smaller. So let's, for example, think of in Iraq, the maximum was 30 individuals who you might put at risk, and there's a risk level defined, civilians for an important military target. If it went above that number, you went to the president or the secretary of defense and said, can I exceed that number of people that we put at risk? But over the course of the Afghanistan and Iraq wars, the number tended to get lower and lower. Mm-hmm. And there's a number of procedures that were used to minimize harm to civilians, because that's the obligation that you commit to under international law and the Uniform Code of Military Justice. And those procedures could include changing the size of the weapon or how the angle the weapon came in or the time of day and so on. But the point is you're trying to minimize harm to civilians. And that combatant casualty cutoff value is supposed to be a signal. Well, we're above that. We've done an assessment. This operation will put more people at risk. Israel, and we don't know for sure, but according to reporting by the New York Times, Israel had a number of 10 prior to this war. 10 civilians could be put at risk in any one operation. This is what they reported. Then they said early in the war, it went up to 20. There's new reporting that it went up much higher. In other words, you could put at risk, and for instance, right now, I guess the value is 20 civilians for a sort of low to medium level Hamas member. But there's apparently a value that's higher for high level people, and they've used this higher value in operations. So that's why you see perhaps tens or hundreds of people injured and killed in an operation to go after one member, high-ranking member of Hamas. Under international law, the obligation is to use precautions, take constant care for distinction, to minimize and avoid harm. This is what the lawyers are to help you do. And according to the Israeli military itself, the lawyers haven't said no to anything.
Mm-hmm. So, in fact, there may not be a number at all at this point.
Well, there's a number, but it's higher than we would like. Mm-hmm. And it's, I think, much higher than 20.
Yeah. Last question to you, Bill. You point out in your paper the extensive degree to which the U.S. has provided support to Israel in terms of ammunition, etc. Based on how the Israelis have conducted the war, used this constant flow of weapons, do you get a sense of how long Israel actually could have conducted its war had it not been for the U.S. support? Could we have seen an end to this war within weeks, months, if the U.S. simply had not provided anything?
Well, Israel could have gone on for some time, but certainly not 2 years. They don't build all those bombs. They don't have the spare parts to keep their planes running. Some years they even buy jet fuel from the U.S. So you can't put a precise number, but much less damage, much less ability to do things like strike Iran. As it is now, Netanyahu is still setting the pace of war in the Middle East. Trump seems to be following him, which is disastrous. The other thing is these long-term consequences. Who's going to control Gaza? Is it safe enough to rebuild? What happens to the refugees? Will anybody who endorsed or supported this genocide be held accountable? And how do you create a voice for the Palestinians to pursue sovereignty in the wake of this conflict? Those are all things that are on the agenda now that have not been addressed in any substantial way.
Thank you so much. And thank you to you, Bill, to David, to Linda, and to Neta for excellent papers and shedding light on what is going on here, to Cost of War for commissioning this, and for all of you for watching. Thank you all so much. Please go to Cost of War's website to be able to download all of these papers and support their work. Thank you so much.